Welcome to Work in Fintech. My name is Matthew Cheung and I am the founder of Work in Fintech. I'm also CEO of a fintech firm called ipushpull, and I'm co-founder of another fintech called New Squawk. And I'm going to teach you about all things fintech. In this episode, you're going to learn from a former Goldman Sachs partner and chief information officer about how they started out, what you need to be successful in your career, and there's even some startup ideas in there too. We'll also be joined by Work in Fintech member Jagraj Singh, who is a physics undergrad student who'll be joining me and asking questions. So for more videos like this, please sign up to workinfintech.com and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Enjoy.
Thanks for taking the time out to talk with us today, Damian. I'm sure our viewers are very eager to hear what you have to say. Could you just give us a bit of an introduction into yourself to kick things off?
Hi, I'm Damian Sutcliffe. I guess I should introduce myself as a retired partner from Goldman Sachs, where I spent the vast majority of my working career. I retired from that a few years ago, and I'm now doing a portfolio of fun activities. First being an advisor and mentor in the fintech space. Second being an advisor to McKinsey, and the final but more substantial part of my life is embarking. I'm 2 years into a PhD in computational biology, so I thought I'd do something completely different and particularly interesting to keep my brain active as I reach old age.
Great, thanks a lot, Damian. Thanks for joining us. We've known each other for 3 years or so now. I think one thing, I don't think I've ever told you this, one thing that I've always been very impressed with you about is that you're an excellent listener. You can take in information, and it could even be a little bit, but you can then provide a lot of insight just on that. So that's one thing I take my hat off to you on. So thanks for that, and thanks for your help with and the mentoring you provided us. So moving into what we want to talk about today, kind of fintech and how you see it and how you get into it. When you started off your career at the very beginning, you were actually a management consultant. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, and an IT management consultant at then Andersen Consulting, now Accenture. So I guess when I was at university, and probably relevant for this video series that you're creating, I knew nothing about the financial markets. I didn't know they existed. I didn't know there were good careers for people with sort of technology or engineering backgrounds in the financial markets. I thought that was the place that people who were doing economics went to work. So the jobs I applied for on the milk round were software developer jobs and IT management consultant jobs. And of the companies that I applied to, Andersen Consulting was quite far ahead in its sell strategy. So it looked a much more appealing place to work, quite exciting. So that's where I started out of university, and I guess in a sort of serendipitous way, I just happened to start in the financial services sector within Andersen Consulting, which opened my eyes up to the financial markets, and from the minute I saw them, I just found them fascinating. There was such breadth to them, such diversity to the types of things that go on in the markets, and they're, in fact, I guess, very fast paced and constantly changing. And there was sort of I guess a natural attraction once I discovered their existence, and so I guess having by chance discovered them, I very quickly realized that's what I wanted to do in terms of my entire focus. Back then, Andersen Consulting liked to generate or develop more general profiles, so not making you industry specific, which I guess was less appealing to me. So I guess after a few years with Andersen Consulting, mostly working at clients in the financial services, I decided to sort of switch over and become fully dedicated by joining Goldman Sachs, where I'd been working with Andersen's for 18 months on a trial basis, I guess. On the one hand, Goldman Sachs is notorious for requiring a lot of interviews to get a job there. So I guess, I could either be in the record books for being the only person that's got a job at Goldman Sachs without having a single interview, or you could say I was the person that had the longest interview because I had an 18-month long interview. But either way, I knew what I was getting into. They quite liked, what they'd seen of me. So it was a pretty safe change, and I'd say it was, best decision I made, because it was just a terrific environment. And as I said, I spent the rest of my working career there.
And so you kind of rose through the ranks from starting out as a developer, and then rose up to partner status, the highest accolade at Goldman Sachs, and probably among the entire financial industry. You said in another interview that Goldman Sachs helped kind of shape you. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I mean, look, I'd say, I when I started there, I was in my early 20s, and I was nearly 50 by the time I left. And so during that time, not only did I sort of grow in terms of the roles I was playing, from developer to project manager to team manager to group manager, and then running divisions and those types of things. I also worked in around the world. So I spent 5 or 6 years in London. Then I was asked to move out to Asia to take a role in Tokyo, where I spent 3 years there, and that was a fantastic experience, not just professionally, but also from a life experience perspective. To live in a different culture, to be a minority in that culture was something new to me, but something that was hugely beneficial in terms of just being able to experience that. I'd say, my time in Japan was really when I made the switch from being a, more hands-on developer to managing, teams and parts of organizations. So it was really, my first induction into management, and you learn a huge amount. I will quickly add, often by making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. But and then after Japan, I was asked to move to New York, and again that was a very different experience, sort of being in the head office from a professional perspective was complementary to being my time up to then working out in the different regional offices, where you could really drive strategy and sort of set the direction. But again, also just from a life experience perspective, at that point, I was in New York, and again, New York is a fantastic place to live in terms of just being quite unique, I'd say, in terms of many things about New York make it unique. But I was lucky enough, I guess, in the sort of Goldman Sachs environment to have worked for some great managers who weren't just managers, but they were mentors, and even after I stopped working for them, they would continue to be sort of mentor roles, play those mentoring roles for me, and those that mentoring went beyond just how to be successful at work. It was sort of how to try and be the best person you can be in your personal life as well, and there was just I guess I've gone from being a sort of maybe not arrogant but cocky young early 20s, this is all easy, I can do this no problems, to realizing frankly how challenging being a good manager is, and there's so much to learn. It takes years to learn, and I'd say the thing that I noticed about management is when you're coding, you get very short feedback loop as to whether you're doing a good job. Does it compile? How efficiently does it execute? Have you done all the right error checks? How fragile is it? Or how resilient is it? All of those things. It's very, very immediate feedback. Whereas when you're managing people, the time frames and the frequency that you get those feedback loops can be measured in months and years, and so it's very hard to know if a decision I'm making today will have positive or negative ramifications 6 months or a year down the line, and that can be very challenging. It can make you much more cautious in terms of making decisions. It can cause you to delay making decisions, and one of the things you often, and again, learn with the benefit of hindsight is some of the things that you regret most as a manager, and maybe not making certain decisions more quickly. And as I say, you have to fill in a lot of the gaps and use your best judgment, and experience is the best way of giving you enough data points of the right things to do in different situations to allow you to have the confidence to make those decisions in at time points before you've got the sort of certainty that they are the right decisions. And so from a sort of intellectual challenge, I found management was incredibly satisfying because it was frankly much harder than I'd expected. So so all of those things, when you realize that, and then I guess as I as an individual had benefited from great managers and mentors over time, you see how much you can then pass on to the people that work for you, and how much you can give to them, and with guidance and advice and support over the years, and seeing how those people that work for you have developed positively and grown in their own capabilities and confidence over the years, again, was probably the ultimate satisfaction that I got in terms of how I judge my career. It's almost the most satisfying things are almost what I gave to the people in the organization, as opposed to projects that I might have delivered, etc.
That's great. For someone working in an investment bank or an asset management firm, how important do you think it is for them to understand technology, and to what extent?
It's a good question. Look, I think I'd say my own personal bias is that technology is already incredibly important and only going to get more important in all aspects of all jobs, not just the financial markets sector, but also all industry sectors. Clearly, I don't think technology will eliminate all other types of job, but it will just continue to become more and more important. And so I think the more you look at activities and processes and job roles, the more that they are at the very least heavily dependent on using technology, and in many cases, to a great extent, partly being replaced by technology. And so I would say if you want the safest bet would be, the more that you know technology, the more opportunities you're going to have, and the more impact you're going to be able to make into the future. And again, that doesn't mean to say that there won't be jobs that aren't dependent on technology, but they will be in an increasing minority. So now, not everybody loves coding, right? Or and there's different types of coding, right? There's sort of hardcore coding for more infrastructure or middleware related aspects, and then there's more functional programming that is maybe capturing or encapsulating a business process into executable code, and then there's potentially leveraging no code or 4GL type languages that allow you with how do we call it, maybe a logical brain to be able to implement the functionality that you want in a sort of technological way without needing to know low-level coding. So there is quite a spectrum, I would say, of technology skills or how technology can be applied. And again, the most important thing is probably that people place themselves on that spectrum in line with where their interests and passions are. Because, in my mind, interests and passions are the most important thing to, being successful and being happy over the course of your career.
Okay. You mentioned coding, which is quite interesting. Do you believe that it's a necessary or certain skill that's needed to be successful in fintech or finance?
Yeah, look, I don't think coding is the only skill by any means. I think the more that you have an understanding of, the either coding or the sort of structured thought process that coding requires, that can be then applied to many other things. But the financial markets have an incredibly complex functional domain. The products that are traded, how the mechanics of the marketplace operate is phenomenally complicated, and so there's a huge amount of value to people that know how the markets work and how the products themselves, are implemented and traded, and the economics behind them, the risks that are implicit in the different types of financial activity. So there's a lot of skills that I think are very important on that side, and frankly, even if the ultimate end game is all of this gets implemented in code and automated and digitized, somebody's got to be able to describe the business process in a way that can then be encoded. And so there's plenty of roles for people that would build more of that type of knowledge. And then there's, just because of the complexity of the environment and the complexity of the large scale projects that go on, the sort of project management and people who can make things make sure things get delivered is also an incredibly valuable skill set. So I would say, coding skills are necessary for a subset of the overall sort of workforce, but they're not to the exclusion of other things. Now, I would say to the extent that you know how to code, you understand how the markets work or how the products are traded, you understand about risk, and you're a good, organized project manager type skill set who can organize your own tasks and those of a group of people around you to orchestrate them in a way that gets stuff delivered. That's clearly, to me, going to be incredibly high value if you've got all of those skill sets, because you can make a much larger impact.
Okay. In the past, you've mentioned that essentially at Goldman you grew up, and obviously it helped. You learned a lot as a person, and it helped shape who you are today. As a university student myself, and as soon to be graduate, what advice would you give to graduates who join banks in the early stages of their careers?
Yeah, it's a good question, and good luck with your finals. Hopefully, you'll be able to do them in person, and 2021 will be more of I guess, a normal year compared to the recent past. Look, I would say the thing that I would tell all university students is that nobody starts out knowing anything more than a fraction of what they need to know to be successful over the course of their career, right? So it doesn't matter where you've been to university, what course you've done, or what you've done in your evenings. Clearly, the more that you've exercised your brain to demonstrate that you can handle large levels of complexity under pressure, that's great in terms of getting you in the door. But that gets you the job. None of those skills will come anywhere close to a fraction of the things that you'll need to learn. So what does that mean? That means that the most important thing you can do once you start working is focus on maximizing your learning. So every day I think of every day as a learning opportunity, and make sure that I maximized what I could learn from every situation that I came across, right? And some of those were good learnings, as in things went well. Why did they go well? Let me remember those things so I can try and do those things again. And some of those can be learnings from things that didn't go well, as in trying to diagnose what caused things to go badly, and again, try and do things differently the next time. And I would say the biggest thing to me that I would say accelerated my own learning, and I've seen other people achieve the same, is the way that you can ask questions so that you extract as much information from people around you who know lots of things. And as you extract that information, piecing it together, processing it, and then coming back with maybe deeper questions or related questions that, as you assimilate more information and you work it through, some things start to make sense and you start to see the interrelationships between things, and some things don't, and that drives you to ask more questions the next time you come across the people who can help you with that. And literally with everything that you do, if that's your approach every day, I guess the rate of your learning will be maximized, and therefore probably your knowledge, your value, your contribution will also be maximized over time as well.
Okay. Obviously, not all graduates go into banks initially in their careers. Some start their own fintech companies and startups. Is there any advice that you'd give to those who do start their own startups?
Yes, I mean, look, I sometimes allow myself to wonder what I would do if I was coming out of college now. Would I join a bank or would I join a fintech? And you know, it was for me. There were, as I say, back then, there weren't fintechs, there weren't small startups developing software. There were big software companies, and those big software companies were, I would say, generally less appealing environments versus being in the bank, where you learn, maybe you get more exposed to the actual financial markets and that sort of functional dimension. But I'd say now, and particularly sort of in London / the UK, the fintech startup space is booming, and there's some really, and I think there's other enablers, right? If you think about um, cloud and open source, these have made a massive shift to lowering the barriers of entry to starting a company. In the old days, if you wanted to start your own technology company, not only did you have to buy all your own servers and maintain the data center that they ran in, you would have to write all of your sort of framework libraries and everything from the ground up. You'd have to write yourself, or pay for commercial software that did those functions. And you look at this now, and there's so much valuable tools in the open source space and in the sort of cloud providers functionality that they offer you to try and get you on board with paying for their compute. It's a pay as you go model. So the less you use in the early stages, you're not paying very much. And as your business grows and revenues grow and you get more successful, you want to use more capacity, but you just request more, and it's there for you. And that is should not be underestimated in terms of how much that's changed the landscape of making it feasible for you or some of your friends to go have a great idea, turn that great idea into reality through code, but then get it scaled at a sort of enterprise level at almost no cost, or at only pay as you go cost, which is transformational. So, in terms of the advice to people who might want to start in go work in a fintech, or actually really entrepreneurially start their own fintech, I'd say you've got to assess probably a few factors. The idea, the product, what is that fintech? What are they trying to solve in the marketplace? What does their product do? There are plenty of examples where the products are a really great solution to a really big problem or a really big gap or a weak point in the marketplace, and those are great. So if you find and that can be hard, I guess, if you're in college, because you don't know the financial markets in detail. But increasingly now, you're pretty familiar with what your own experiences are on retail banking, or potentially even starting to buy and sell some stocks, or maybe starting to think about putting some money in a pension, right? All of these things you have views on because you've started to interact with those things and use those systems. And if you think you can do better, that's probably an easier place to start if you were starting your own company, because you'd have more experience of it than, getting knee deep in the capital markets, where probably you need a few years at least experience working in a bank to know the capital market area well enough, know what its strengths and weaknesses are, and know where the opportunities are. So it's, that's sort of, you've got to assess the idea if you're joining a company, or if it's your own idea, make sure you think it's got real substance. Then I'd say, you've got to look at the people. So if you're, again, joining a small startup, you're much more heavily dependent on the leadership of that startup and their vision, their capability, their track record, etc. Right? And that's pretty important, because your job security is much more tied to their individual capabilities than in a big company. Right? And then, to the extent possible, you've got to think about timing. Right? It could be the best idea in the world. It could be a great leadership team at the startup. But if there's some reason why it's too early, or some other things need to change before that idea can become the success that it could become, then there are timing aspects that you've got to consider. But I'd say those are the three primaries: the idea, the leadership of the startup, and sort of timing. Does it make sense?
Yeah. In terms of the financial sector, fintech is still relatively a new area. What would you define as a fintech?
Yeah, so look, in its broadest sense, it's any technology that is written for use in the financial services industry. As I say, over time, that has encapsulated big software companies, but now it's more increasingly just targeted at the sort of startup world, the smaller companies. And so, I'd say it can be anything from, infrastructure related technology through to, the very sort of functionally specific automation of human processes, whether that be, using machine learning or artificial intelligence to make investment decisions, or execute, to quote prices, or to review, risks and potential compliance flaws. Right? You can run the whole gamut of where that technology solution fits best, but it ultimately, for it to be called fintech, it's ideally got something that makes it specific to the financial sector, right? I mean, there's, I guess, enterprise tech is a more general term for some of the more infrastructure related plays that can be applicable to the financial industry, but are equally applicable to other industry sectors, etc.
Do you think there are any specific areas of the financial industry in general which have advanced more as a result of fintech?
Yeah, I think there's probably been, as I say, if I look at successful disruption, it's probably been more extensive on the retail side. Now you've got examples of challenger banks that are really well capitalized and quite substantial players, and have some notable advantages over the incumbents in terms of lower cost base and cleaner systems architectures, etc. I'd say in the capital markets space, it is not that you will ever find a fintech startup that replaces an investment bank. But what you will find is fintech companies that are providing solutions, specific solutions to particular problems in the capital market space. And as I say, that's why you need to have a decent amount of sort of real experience in the capital markets to know where those problems exist and where those opportunities to fix those problems exist. And then I would say, in many ways, if your solution can be quite targeted to the right problem, it can be much easier to articulate the value of it, much easier to, it's sort of an oxymoron saying easy sales cycle into investment bank, as I'm sure Matt will will regale you with many stories of pain and misery trying to extract contracts from investment banks. But it's your best chance for as short a sales cycle as possible if you can articulate the value of your product and how it's going to integrate in a much larger ecosystem the bank's existing technology, some of which may be leading edge and some of which may be very legacy. And so you've got to think about integration of your point solution into that space is critical to success.
Okay. And finally, what opportunities do you see in fintech in, say, the short, near-term, and long-term future? So 3, 5, 10 years?
Well, clearly, all my good ideas I'll keep to myself to start up my own companies to be successful. Anyway, no, I personally am incredibly passionate about domain modeling, because the one thing that struck me about the capital markets in particular is why it's so hard for for startups to start to break into that space, is because there is no definition in many cases of how those markets operate and how the products should be structured and why they work the way they are and how they should interact. What you do have is in the form of thousands of pages of legal documents, either written from the regulators or the banks make customers and counterparties sign, which are largely unintelligible to most humans and cause massive fees to be paid to lawyers across the whole sector every year. And so, in my mind, there's no reason why we couldn't have defined a domain model that describes the financial industry, the products in it, how they're traded, the counterparties, the operational processes, the exchanges. All of these things can be defined in a structured way, and the domain model will give you the relationships between those things. And then you could have regulators start to define their regulatory rules in the context of that domain model. And those regulatory rules could be written in essentially as machine readable form or as almost machine executable form if we go far enough down the track. So that immediately reduces a huge amount of cost from the industry, because at the moment regulators produce thousands of pages of legal documents, and then banks all have to spend millions of dollars on lawyers and internal sort of decoding of those documents into stuff that they implement. It massively reduces the risk because it's the rules themselves would be incredibly precise, and so there'd be no ambiguity and no risk of misinterpretation and mistakes. And then you think just about internally within a bank, if there's this common language of how everything is, products are structured and what the data attributes are, the cost within the bank massively reduces because they've got hundreds of different representations of swaps or FX products, etc. currently today. And then you've got all of these point-to-point interactions with the hundreds of liquidity points or exchanges in the marketplace, all with their own formats of how you need to interact with them. You could bring a standardization to the industry across these things with just something that is, if everybody agrees on a common language, that domain model forms that common language, you can just transform the cost of the industry, which is always under pressure because margins are being reduced as competitive forces are at work there. You've got regulatory and reputational risks that are huge and significant. You've got other forms of operational risk that are increasingly driving larger and larger amounts of capital to be set aside at the banks. So all of this is making the current industry less and less sustainable. And people are trying to automate this stuff, but they're trying to automate it without defining a machine readable definition of the capital markets. So this was something I spent a couple of years very focused on in my last couple of years working at Goldman's. And there are good initiatives ongoing in the industry to start to pull this together. But I just wish that all of the players in the industry could start to sort of see this future state, which would be radically different from where we are today, but much safer, much cheaper, and by the way, much more open in terms of lowering the barriers of entry for startups of different shapes or forms. Because if there is that common language and you code to that interface as a startup, you've immediately got the whole industry that can communicate with you rather than needing to, hand code interfaces to each of the different players in the marketplace. So that's a passion for me, and I think the opportunity there is enormous. And if that does start to take off, then that just opens up huge follow-on opportunities for all sorts of different startups to take advantage of that in a much more cost-effective way. So.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Damian. Thanks for giving our listeners a startup idea there. That was great to listen to. Lots of excellent advice and lots of things I can take away myself and kind of digest and think about. Just a last question on a more personal level. Have you got any advice around what people should read or what they should listen to? Any good routines that you may have?
Oh, well, I mean, I when I was working, I found I always had an interest in, let's say, the control side of banks. What the revenue side is like a wild animal that will go after revenue in an untamed way as aggressively as it can. That's good for achieving revenue, but they won't have an eye on the risks. And so, my job on the control side of the fence was appropriately enabling the business, but with the right controls, so people, didn't get ahead of themselves. And so I used to read, books about, the well-known financial failures that had happened. Over the years, whether that's long-term capital management, Enron, the financial crisis. There's all manner of books, but I've always found that learning from things that went wrong hopefully allows you to do better the next time, and then maybe preempt some of those problems. But that's more in the functional domain, I'd say. On the sort of technical side, I guess I've gone back very hands-on with my PhD. I largely code every day, and I've been sort of learning, getting quite deep into machine learning, and that clearly is, a great space to spend time learning and becoming knowledgeable about, even if not to the extent of being an expert coder of machine learning models, but knowing about machine learning approaches so that you can use the models safely is incredibly valuable. So, I'd say those two things I would say, just from a personal perspective, I would thoroughly recommend.
Great. Thanks a lot there, Damian. We'll wrap up now. So we heard from Damian Sutcliffe, ex-partner at Goldman Sachs and advisor to various fintechs and also McKinsey. Thank you for your time.